All right, Jasmine, thanks for being here.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
You have some questions for me.
Oh, yes. Yes. One of the hardest things about trying to come up with a question for this is picking only 3. The way that you explained this story and how you presented its meaning really, I think, does such a good job of making you think about just how many different ways you can take it and how many different parts of your life you can actually apply this story to. And one of the things I think that is not great about the way that the church usually represents the story is I think that it actually can take away a person's individuality by saying, you have to do this one thing to solve all of your problems or even to prevent you from having problems. But the challenges we face in life, I think, are the things that really, above all else, define who we are. Even the story of Daniel. Daniel is defined by this story. This is how we know Daniel. It's the story of the lion's den, if you have to pick one thing. So what would you say about that? How damaging could it be, or what issues are there with presenting the same solution for every problem?
Great question, Jasmine. I think that really comes down to a lot of what happens when we're talking about the Bible specifically. I mean, you think about what the Bible is, and it's 66 books written by, I think it's like 40 different people. It's 35 to 40, somewhere in there. And religion's typical response is, oh no, there's not 35 to 40 authors, there's one. It's all God, and it's just one correct answer. Well, I think that flattens the diversity of Scripture and actually takes it from a living word to a much more static word, and it becomes less inspiring. And even this story of Daniel, like I listened to it, and it was one of my favorite stories growing up. I like the lions, and especially lions that don't hurt anybody. But I think that to accept what that was as part of my story and know that this is a story that I've loved, and then to read it again and say, oh my word, this is so profound. This is about a guy who does everything right and still ends up with undeserved suffering. And it's like, why did we flatten this into just one interpretation? One thing that was in the sermon until the very last part was the church trying to convince Daniel that he wasn't actually in the lion's den. Which is something that I think the church does, but in that flattening of personality that you described, is that rather than deal with the complexity and the effort to get to know people and to embrace diversity, it's much easier and self-righteous to just flatten it into one perspective. So I think that it's almost like a temptation of laziness to not be willing to take the time to express the diversity of the image of God rather than just a single one.
Okay, yeah. And then one of the other things that I thought about when listening to the outline and hearing it, which was part of just hearing you speak it rather than seeing the outline, was the way you presented it here was just so much more rich, almost. And one of the things I think that you try to say that this teaches us, and when I see it that I think that it should teach, is that when you inevitably come to a low point or a challenging point in your life, to just remember that you aren't alone. And that also means, of course, that you can reach out for help from anyone that you know. You know, if you are struggling, you have people around you to help you. And what would you say about that?
Yeah, that's part of what this community is about. There are people who are both in the valley and on the mountaintop spiritually right now. And it's not the people who attend the church the most that are on the mountaintop only. This is a group of people who are living life, and we come to church some weeks, and some weeks are better than others, and other weeks we're having a hard time. We're barely making it here. The church has typically squashed that, and the reason why is because there's always a temptation as religious leaders to turn worship service into a propaganda service. And the reason why is because there's this idea that there might be somebody who's walking through the door for the first time to church, so you better tell them everything that's good about religion. Which I understand that, and I've participated in that in my life. I will tell you that people could find to go to the videotape and find a lot of me doing that. I would say to that, what I found in my career in ministry is that people usually come in already with a negative assessment of religion. And the minute you can empathize with that for just a minute, they're going to listen a lot more to the positive side of religion after you validate that first. Because empathy is something that we want to make sure is really important, not just at Paradox, but in every church, to make sure that people feel validated and seen from the moment they walk in our doors. So I would say that it's really important, and this story is a reminder that yes, there is the rise of Daniel. Yes, there's the deliverance and this idea that Daniel prospers in the end. But there's also the fall and the lion's den. And if we can include all of those in a worship service, then we can hopefully empathize with a wider variety of people and give them some inspiration or some excitement or some love for what life is and who God is.
All right. So the last thing that immediately comes to mind for me, because when I take stories from the Bible, I often relate them to literature. Are you familiar with Joseph Campbell?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So he has this phenomenal book called The Hero's Journey, which is just about what you go through in life and what a hero goes through in a story. And the Lion's Cave is, of course, in literature, it's the darkest cave. It's the lowest point of the journey of the hero, right? Because they have, at this point, there is no hope. Everything is gone, right? And we've all, I'm sure, been at that point in our lives where we felt like things are completely hopeless. But you have to, I think, remember, and this ties back to like the first and second questions as well, but life is a journey, and it's this cycle of highs and lows and highs and lows. And as long as you remember that this is something that my friend loves to say, is that whenever things are bad, just remember that eventually they will get better. Right? As long as you remember and try and put effort into making them become better.
Yeah, to that I would say I have a lot of church memories in my mind, right? And the church says something like that with a very shallow kind of depth to it. And the reason for that is because there's like this real discomfort with the idea that God might abandon you at some point, even though that's testified throughout Scripture in the book of Lamentations, Jesus on the cross saying, "Why have you forsaken me, God?" Like, that's part of a Christian journey, is experiencing the abandonment of God as well. And so what happens so often is that when the church says things like, the one I've heard that's similar to what your friend said, is they've said something like, everything will work out in the end. If it's not working out, it's not the end. And while that's valuable, and I actually believe it on a pretty deep level, there is a lack of willing to empathize and lament alongside someone who is hurting that needs to be stated, or that space has to be given volume before something like that is uttered. And the way that your friend said it to you sounds like there was this empathy and this understanding of the journey that went with it. And where the church has messed up is they've skipped the lament, or they've skipped the, oh, this is an injustice, or oh, this is hard, or they haven't shed tears with the person. And so while it may sound sentimental and cheap to say it'll work out in the end, there is a difference between that and going very far into the lion's den and then still holding on to that. So I think those are two things that the church, that's something that the church could do better. So great question.
Of course, no problem.
Let's turn to the congregation's questions.
Awesome. So often we blame Satan for our suffering. when I have bad news, friends tell me the devil is at work. Why does this not make me feel better?
Because on some level, your friends are asking you to believe in the devil. They're asking you to believe in the work of the devil and to trust it. Now, what's interesting is my wife and I just went up the Oregon coast a few months ago, and they have just about everything is named the devil, like the devil's churn or the devil's like pie. And it's like all these raging sea like coming together and like smashing against the rocks. And while it's maybe hard for people to understand a devil that haven't grown up in the church, like I look at that and with all my doubt or whatever about the devil, I look at him like there's something evil happening there. It's just so chaotic and it's so angry, and you can understand why someone assigned the attribute or the name of the devil to it. So there is this experience that people have been writing about where it's just water smashing against rocks, but it feels like something more that I think is really valid. It's one of those things like if something bad happens, then something happens on top of it. You say when it rains, it pours. That's expressing a feeling, not a scientific fact, right? It feels like it's pouring extra on me. It's not like this caused that. So when it comes to this, like the idea that why this doesn't make you feel better is because it's asking you to believe in the devil, but ultimately it's this idea that you are in the fall because there is an equal God that's lower that's pulling you down, which is a bit frightening to think about. And at the same time, there are times we walk into a room and we feel like something's off or we feel like something's bad, and I want to say that that's important to pay attention to as well. So that's what I would say to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. If no matter what we do, we fall, should we still strive to be good?
What a great question. I would say that the life of Jesus says yes. The life of Jesus has a crucifixion in it. And you could say there's resurrection. I would say that Jesus probably didn't know about that resurrection beforehand. There are some scriptural references where Jesus appears to know about it. But I don't think that made the crucifixion any easier to go through. So, what was that?
Like they're nails to your hands.
They're nails to your hands. It's never, you can never say, oh, this isn't that bad. It's about as bad as it gets, right? And so for that, I would say that the life of Jesus is the ultimate inspiration in the fact that your life is worth living even though there is death most likely at the end. And it is worth it to love someone with everything that you have, because in that love you can find a lot of value and worthwhile experiences in life. In my head right now is a John Green book called The Fault in Our Stars. And you can say, oh, trashy young adult romance novel. No, not taking that. He talks about, it's about two teenagers who fall in love even though they both have a cancer diagnosis, and whether or not it's actually worth loving or not, and I can't recommend that book high enough.
It's easy to avoid the fall and the lion's den in our lives. Do you think it's necessary to feel the fall to experience God's presence?
Yes, I do. I do. And the reason why is because Barbara Brown Taylor writes a book called Learning to Walk in the Dark. And she says, all the Christians I know want to compare God's love to the sun, where it's always there and always on. She's like, I have found that God's love is much more like the moon. Some days it's bright and vivid, and other days I can't even see it. And when she writes that, she talks about how you can either have half a life where things are good, and then you just try to get rid of all the bad and don't pay attention to it, or you can wrap your arms around the whole thing. So when we talk about the fall and the lion's den, what we're talking about is we're talking about an embrace of the totality of life and all of it rather than just half a life. So I think we have time for two more.
Are you saying that my grandmother's bathroom poster of Jesus' footsteps in the sand is inaccurate?
Oh, for anyone who doesn't know what this is talking about, there's a story. You can find videotape of me preaching it. It's really embarrassing. It's very deep on the internet, I just want you to know. There's a story where there's footprints in the sand, and it's two people walking side by side, and then someone says, Jesus, you left me here. And Jesus is like, no, that's where I carried you. And it's a really nice story, but it's everywhere. So as far as it being accurate, I would say that it isn't 100% accurate. However, there is something valuable about that story, And while it is fun to poke fun at it, there are things from that story that I personally believe. I probably wouldn't preach in another sermon like that, but I've seen that grandmother's poster as well. And don't confront your grandma on it. Just hug her and love her because she's valuable. Last question.
What advice would you give someone who is finding a hard time making it through when God feels absent?
So I don't know if I'm talking to the person who's going through this or if I'm talking to a person who has a friend who's going through this. So I'm just going to assume that I'm talking to a person who's going through this. I want you to know that I have given my life to participating in this religion. That I have gone to church school, I've gotten good grades, I got a master's degree, I got a doctorate, I got ordained, like all the things you could possibly get. And I don't tell you this to brag to you. I tell you this because there are days that I feel God's absence too. And it is not because you're deficient. It's not because there's something wrong with you. It's because you are human. And the tradition makes room for you, even when religion says there is no room for you. And so the thing that I want to say to you, if you're saying, I don't feel God's presence, I don't feel God around me, I want you to know I've felt it too. I may be feeling it right now. And all I can say is, you are not alone. So may we lament together and ask, how long, O Lord, will you hide your face from us? And maybe a few months down the road, we can celebrate when we either see the presence of God or see how this lament has shaped us. That's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Craig.
Thank you. Thank you, Jasmine. Thanks for all your questions.